All right, so welcome everyone. Today I'm going to go over two plugins. The first one will be the Fluff 2C by ML Sound Labs. The second one will be the new Mesa Boogie Neural DSP archetype. The ML Sound Labs actually released a few months ago, and I think it was at the end of 2022. And then the new Neural DSP Boogie actually just released like last week. At first I wanted to compare them because I was like, oh, well, they're both based off of the Mark 2C. But it's not quite that easy. Both of these amplifiers are actually sort of different in how they sound overall, and as much as I've tried, I really can't get them to sound alike even with the same impulse response. So instead of comparing them directly, which you kind of got a bit of that in the beginning, and towards the end of the video I will reveal which one was which, both of them do serve different purposes, and rather than trying to sort of say which one's better or worse, I think it makes more sense for us to look at what each offer and what you might want to get out of a Mark 2C sort of plugin. I will say both of them have a lot to offer, and I like a lot of what both of them do, and depending on the situation, I might use one or the other. Also, before we continue on, if you like the content you see here, please consider hitting the subscribe and like buttons. It really helps out the channel. I'm looking to try to grow this channel as big as I can, so any of those clicks will be very, very appreciated. And for our setup, I'm basically going straight DI into my interface, into my Reaper DAW. I will be loading my own IR. Both of these amps will be using the Ownhammer Essentials Mesa Boogie Rectifier IR with SM57. And so you really get to see just what the amp can do rather than the amp in the cabinet as well. My guitar is a Kiesel Osiris with Dimarzio Illuminator in the bridge and Air Norton in the neck. I'll mostly be using bridge in this one, and we're going to be mostly focused on high gain tones for this. Maybe in the future I'll dive into sort of crunch tones, but for the purpose of this video I do want to get into that kind of like Lamb of God like kind of tones out of either of these plugins. Alright, the first one we're going to go over is the Fluff 2C, and this one's actually a lot simpler. So instead of having 3 master volumes like the actual 2C does, this one only has 2. And the present style that's usually in the back of a 2C is pushed to the front here. We have a bright switch, and we have the 5-band EQ that the Mark series is known for. And in my opinion, this is most of what you need. You don't need too much more than this to get a good tone out of the Mark 2C. This plugin also offers a bunch of pedals on a pedal board and a speaker IR for either if you want to load your own IRs or if you want to put some mics on the actual speaker cones. And for those who have actually used a Mark series amp, a lot of these amps are very hard to dial in, and so this one actually simplifies it quite a bit, and you'll see what I mean in a few seconds when we start diving into the tones that this can have. And so with every sort of Mark series amp, if you try to start with everything at noon, it doesn't sound so great. Everything here is at noon other than the input gain and the master. All the EQs set flat, and basically bass, middle, treble, presence is at noon. So as you can tell, it's very stuffy sounding, very boxy sounding, and so the usual tip that a lot of people give with Mesa Boogie amps is treat the bass, middle, and treble knobs as sort of your pre-amp boost. And so what you want to do is you want to reduce the amount of bass in the signal before it hits your preamp in most cases, and this is kind of equivalent to running an overdrive before any other amplifier. But in the case of a 2C, you're going to want to roll that bass all the way down. I usually leave it at 1. The mids on a 2C are more lower mids as well, so you actually will want to lower that a bit too. So for example, here's the mids right now. And that mid-range is very stuffy sounding, and so if you roll it down to just 1, which is what I'm also going to do here, and this isn't the final tone by any means, but this is what you're going to have to do before we start actually dialing in the amp. You hear like the difference, it's a little bit less stuffy. For the treble, you're going to want to boost the treble a bit. I boosted to about 8. And now you hear that with the EQ set the way that it is, it's actually quite balanced. It's not quite as stuffy. It's not perfect yet, and that's what the EQ is going to be doing. The EQ is going to be what you use to actually dial in the amp itself. With a Mark amp, you're going to want to roll down that 750. For whatever reason, Mark amps just have a lot of that frequency, and so even just rolling that down and not touching anything else, you basically get a pretty open mid-range. And now it still sounds like the high end and the low end are kind of missing, and so we're going to kind of boost those with this EQ. I'm going to be pushing 80 hertz a little bit more, and then 240 just below that, boosting the high end, the 220 and the 6000, just to the same level above the line right here. I usually leave the bright switch off, and then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crank the presence a little bit, not too much, but just enough to give it a little bit of cut through a mix. And yeah, that's basically the Mark IIc tone that I usually go for. It's a very, I wouldn't say it's quite scooped, but it gives you a feeling of being scooped while still being very cutting in a mix, which is not really common if you try to scoop any other amp. Usually you have to push the mid-range pretty far, and so a Mark series amp actually does a really good job with that, with kind of the upper mids pushing through the mix a lot more if you set the amp up this way. My opinion on the Fluff IIc, I think it sounds great. It's very straightforward. You kind of get a very easy tone right out of the box with a lot of the presets, and I think that it just covers a lot of bases. This actually is just really good out of the box, and while it doesn't sound exactly like the Neural DSP one, I think both of these sound relatively similar to a Mark series. All right, moving on to the Neural DSP. This is the new plugin, and there are actually two amps that come with this. So there's this one right here, which is kind of that lower gain, and then this is a higher gain version of this amp. I believe both of them are based off of different revisions. This is a 2C++, and this is a 2C+. I don't know the difference, other than I feel like the 2C++ has more gain. I actually felt the 2C++ felt closer to what I got from the Fluff 2C. So we're going to be using this one as to dial in. Starting with everything at noon, we will do that thing once again where we pull down the bass to about 1, pull down the mids to about 1, and push the treble up to about 8. For this amp in particular, you're going to have to pull out the lead on the lead drive to get the distortion channel, and then I'm actually also going to pull out the deep because I feel like that matches what I remember from the Fluff a little bit more. One thing to know about this plugin, since there is 3 master volumes, you have to kind of use them to act like a gain stage. And so what we're going to do is for volume 1, I'm going to push it all the way up to like 8. So once again, down to like 5, up to 8. So now this sounds like the appropriate amount of gain, and so onto the EQ section we go to actually dial in the amp. Once again, we're going to pull down that 700 hertz, and then I'm going to push up that 80, and actually I'm going to leave that 240 where it is, and I'm going to push up the 2200 and the 6600 the same way I did on the Fluff 2C. And so I'm actually also going to turn down a little bit of that gain, and I'm not going to use the lead drive. I'm going to turn down the other 2 masters a little bit. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to turn this amp around, and we're going to turn up the presence just a slight bit. This one sounds actually more organic to me. I feel like the 2C has always been more of a crunch amp that has been boosted into high gain. The Fluff 2C actually almost sounds like it has another boost in front of it by default, which it doesn't, but that's kind of how it feels like to me. It's already boosted into high gain territory, whereas I feel like the Neural DSP is a little bit more correct in that the 2C was definitely more of a crunch amp that people boosted into high gain territory. So what I'm going to do, and I said earlier that I wouldn't compare the pedals, but what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to turn on an overdrive really quick. And usually with overdrives, you just push the level, lower the drive. So the gain's also been pulled down, and I boosted 240 again with the overdrive on, and this is what it sounds like. And that's like the perfect amount of saturation for me. And it's also really nice and twangy as well. This is how I'd run the Neural DSP version of this, definitely with the boost in front. Whereas I could get away without the boost on the Fluff 2C. I think the Neural DSP definitely gives you more options. I haven't even gone over the shift knobs here. Those are tones that I have not personally used when I used a actual Mark series. So basically adjust kind of where the bass is being boosted and where the trebles are being boosted. I don't usually touch the bright switches with boogie amps because the way that you set it up is already plenty bright in my opinion. And so I don't think you would need the bright switches at all unless you had a very, very dark pickup. Also, with the fact that you can change the simulclass or class A power amp section to what you prefer between the two, it is absolutely like giving you more options than what the Fluff gives you, but at the expense of you really need to know how to dial in a Mark series to get that metal tone. And so yeah, that's my overview of these two amps and how I would dial them in. Ever since I had played my friend's Mark V, I've actually really enjoyed the Mark IIC sound. And I personally want to get my hands on the Synergy 2C, but this is a great kind of in-between for me. And I'm very excited to have this within my DAW to use for recording. And so yeah, my conclusion is that I actually don't think one is better than the other. I went into this fully expecting to want to like one more than the other, but I never ended up actually liking one more than the other. I think both of them have a lot to offer. The Mark IIC Neural Suite is a lot easier to mess up, and you can definitely create some terrible tones with it if you don't know what you're doing, versus the Fluff 2C, which I think just sounds great out of the box. It does a better job of just letting you have immediate good sounding metal 2C tone, but it definitely doesn't have a lot of the options if you're looking for more sort of gain structure switches and whatnot. And so kudos to both ML Sound Labs and Neural. I think both of these sound really good. This was kind of what I wanted from the John Petrucci, for example. The John Petrucci archetype is more focused on the overall soundscapes of the tones that John Petrucci creates and not the amp itself. This plugin definitely gives me what I kind of wanted from that plugin to begin with. That's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for sticking around while I dialed in these plugins. And yeah, I will see y'all in the next one. Later.